Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Matt Thomas, and thank you for tuning into the USGS Landslide Hazards Seminar. This meeting is hosted by the Landslide Hazards Program and co-organized with contributions from Stephen Slaughter and Jamie Kostelnik. For those of you that are new to this meeting, you're going to have the ability to submit questions via the chat window or to use the raise your hand feature in combination with your microphone and video camera. But we're going to wait until the end of today's presentation to take questions. So in the meantime, if you're not intending to speak, please do the best you can to make sure your microphone is muted and your video camera is off. It's my pleasure today to introduce Ben Muris. Ben is a supervisory research geologist in the USGS Landslide Hazards Program. He earned his bachelor's degree in geology from Pomona College and started his career with the USGS as a graduate student intern in Menlo Park, California, while pursuing a PhD in hydrogeology at Stanford. He then served on the faculty at UNC Chapel Hill, teaching and advising students before returning to the USGS, this time in Colorado, in 2015. In his current role, Ben leads a growing team of scientists and postdocs and applies his background in geology, hillslope hydrology, and numerical modeling towards developing new tools for landslide hazard assessment and loss reduction. Ben, thanks for joining us today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Matt, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for your attention. It's a very exciting opportunity to share this new work with you. We've developed a new national landslide susceptibility map and the corresponding journal article titled here, Parsimonious Approach to Continental Scale Landslide Susceptibility Modeling. I want to take a quick moment to acknowledge my co-authors, Gina Belair and Sabrina Martinez here at the Geologic Hazard Science Center, and Nate Wood and Gene Jones in the Western Geographic Science Center. All of them had pivotal roles in this work, and I really am grateful for such a great team to work with. So just to start off, what are landslide susceptibility maps? Probably everyone's familiar with the concept, but just to state all this up front, landslide susceptibility maps show where landslides are more and less likely throughout a landscape. Usually they use some sort of a terrain, environmental variables as predictors, and there are a wide range of approaches to this now, statistical, physically based, and an increasing emphasis on machine learning and data-driven approaches. All of them rely very heavily on landslide position data, which introduces its own sources of biases, but typically they're applied at local scales. There are, however, a few regional and global applications that I'll mention. It is also very important to talk about what a susceptibility model is not. It does not account for frequency, magnitude, or impacts. At the local scale, you might be able to assume some equivalence between susceptibility and hazard, such as shown in these two examples here. There's work by Stephen Hughes and Bill Schultz for Puerto Rico, and Jacob Woodard and others using slope units for catchment in Oregon. And at smaller scales, you can sort of assume some of that equivalence, but as you get to bigger and bigger scales, we really do not account for those hazard elements. And so the constraints on timing recurrence are really common across broad areas, and so susceptibility maps, especially at continental scales, are really just where our landslides potential throughout that landscape. The big question, why a new national map? Well, first of all, landslides occur in every state and most U.S. territories, but only a few states have a concentrated program on assessing landslide hazards, and so there's a lot of areas where that's needed, and then there isn't really a great national picture as of now. In particular, there have been some recent improvements in USGS data and capabilities, including high-res 3-depth digital elevation models, improved high-performance computing. We use the YETI, but now there's even a new HPC resource for the USGS. And also, what I'll talk about shortly are compilation of landside inventories across the country. So there were some existing maps, and those were based on older, limited data. Then they tended to underrepresent landsliding in moderate terrain, and also many suffered from incomplete coverage over the U.S., especially in Alaska. So in addition to the course resolution, 1 kilometer, it's really insufficient for many applications. There was a real need to leverage all these improvements in data and resources to do better. And that is also within the context of the National Landslides Preparedness Act passed in 2021. in that there's many regions of the country which are referred to with basically no or minimal landslide reporting and assessments, and a real need for a nationwide understanding of the potential exposure and risk. So this susceptibility model is kind of one of the steps along that path to an improved national scale understanding. And our objective here was to promptly develop an improved, uniform, high-resolution national map. There are a few existing maps. These were just for CONUS. The first on the left is a landslide overview map of the Continental United States, published by Radbrook Hall et al. In 1982. This is based on a kind of national overview and synthesis of geologic mapping available at the time. It went to the 750 million scale. And they included 6 susceptibility and incidence classes, you can see here, ranging from the sort of yellow, green, brown, pink, and red. It's a little bit complicated to describe, so I won't get into it, but this map is still getting used and downloaded today. On the right is a topographic slope relief threshold. This is a prototype map that was developed by Gott and others in 2012 and published, and actually it was being used by Department of Interior until we produced this updated map in its present form. And I'm going to describe that one in a little bit more detail because we used a very similar approach. There were a couple global maps, most notably the NASA's heuristic fuzzy logic model, which uses slope, forest loss, roads, and geology to develop 5 global susceptibility classes ranging from very low to very high. They did this based on 70,000 landslides from a handful of high-quality inventories and then some distributed throughout the globe. And they this is what's used in the LASA model, the version 1 of the LASA model. In the meantime, there's also a global non-susceptibility map. I'll talk a little bit more about how that was developed, but it also uses the slope relief model to define non-susceptibility zones. And so you can see the red areas sort of correspond actually reasonably well to the green and blue areas in the NASA model. And they used a modified area under the curve method using about 40,000 landslides from high quality inventories across the globe. They also looked at kind of landslide type and whatnot, and interesting insights. I recommend looking at both these papers. However, the number of landslides in both those studies is relatively small, and we started compiling back in 2018 landslide inventories done by all the great folks at state surveys and researchers and previous USGS folks mapping all over the country, and put those into one readily accessible uniform database. And that is the initial compilation published in 2019 included just over 300,000 landslides. Version 2 in 2022 was updated, roughly doubled that number. And now we're working on version 3, which should be released soon, and we're approaching 1 million landslides. Really exciting. But we do still have a long way to go. For reference, Italy's national inventory compilation has about 600,000 landslides. So for a much bigger country, we expect much greater number. There's different types and trigger landslides. There's also highly variable data quality from points, polygons, media reports, and that's what's expressed in these colors here, ranging from light yellow to red. But there's fairly limited information on timing or triggering mechanism. And if you're interested in downloading that data set, you can visit this DOI here. I'm also going to just show a quick zoom in to illustrate that one of the artifacts of Arc Online, where this service is hosted to zoom around, you can look at it. You can see when you start zooming in, you see much of the higher quality polygon mapping, whereas the points just stay the same size when you zoom in and out. So now we have this great database, and I mentioned that the data is a really important part of susceptibility modeling. So now we have the data with which to start moving forward and improving the map, but what method are we going to use? Now this shows sort of 2 end members in terms of model complexity. And I would strongly argue that more predictors and more variables that you throw into a susceptibility model at the continental scale is not better. So on the left, we've got a simple slope index model developed by Earl Brab and USGS colleagues in 1999. And this is just a simple where across the US are slopes greater than 25 degrees. This is attempted to focus on shallow landslides and debris flows, which wasn't really considered in the Radbrook Hall et al. Map. And you can see the data they used is sort of the more vivid bright red, and then their model of threshold exceedance is the lighter pink. Now on the right is, in quotes, state-of-the-art machine learning, and this uses 32 predictors with a number of automated naive data-driven models. And what this group did was they took 65,000 of our landslides from the national compilation. I'm not sure, it doesn't explain in the paper how they selected those, but they're shown in the upper figure here, and then their susceptibility map is shown in the lower figure. And what you can see is that it's basically a model of where landslides have been observed, but it's not very useful for predicting where landslides may be occurring. And we know that from looking at our database here, for example, landslides in Minnesota, parts of Nevada, that just aren't even considered. So this is too many predictors, perhaps. You're over-calibrating the model to just fit your data such that you develop a model of your data rather than a model of landslide susceptibility. So we wanted something in between, something that's better than just slope, but also is going to be useful everywhere and not overfit to the data that we have. And one of the reasons for that is that landslide controls are very complicated. There's a lot of things that influence landslide initiation. On the left here are just 5 pictures of landslides I've visited throughout the U.S. And the first one here, Boulder County aspect, is a really important control on landslide occurrence, north-facing versus south-facing slopes and vegetation. Here in North Carolina, actually, this is Macon County, and in the study here on the right, I'm showing a figure from Jacob Woodard's JGR paper in 23, that slope is not necessarily a great predictor of landslides in Macon County. In fact, we see an inverse relationship between slope and susceptibility, and it's because there's some of these big slow-moving landslides occurring at gentler slopes, and there's some geologic controls. Here in Contra Costa County, California, is a big landslide on a very planar slope, so not occurring in those typical hill slope hollows that we think of, whereas here in Sitka, Alaska, it is on the very steepest conversion hill slope hollow. Whoops. And then here on the right in Fremont County, Wyoming, it's not the steepest slope, again, where landslides are initiating. They're initiating right below these bedrock cliffs, and so there's probably some other processes going on, the hydrology there. And essentially what Jacob's paper showed is that you can develop a very robust susceptibility model for a location where you have good data. And you can take data from across a number of regions and develop a susceptibility model that works really well in all those regions. But if you take the data out for one region and then calibrate the model for all those other regions, and then try to use it for the location where you pulled the data out, it performs quite poorly. And that's, again, because there's these very complex controls on landslide initiation that we don't want to over-parameterize a model so that it is not useful in places where we don't have data. And that's exactly the point of a susceptibility model here now. So to do a little bit better than just topographic slope, we looked to a really excellent study by Kevin Schmidt and Dave Montgomery, published in 1995, looking at slope and relief. And they used 17th century engineering geologist, Coleman, 1875 paper, to show that there's this rock strength control on slope and relief, and that in highest relief areas, you've got stronger earth materials exposed such that those can support steeper slopes, and you got a steeper slope for landslide, threshold slope for landsliding. And lower relief is much gentler slopes where they may be unstable and fail. And I've just got some nice pictures from Nepal to really illustrate what a beautiful high relief landslide terrain can look like. So this is sort of the theoretical underpinning for the slope relief threshold. And here's how Gott and others implemented it back in 2012. They plotted slope, cumulative frequency distribution of slope for 5 different inventories from New Jersey to North Carolina to Oregon, New Mexico, San Francisco, and then also the same CDF of relief. And then they took the 10th percentile for each of those 5 inventories, plotted them against each other for slope and relief, and developed this really nice stepwise linear function. And you can see it works very nicely. Above that threshold, there's some potential for landslides. Below it, there is none. And that was based on 30,000 landslides from 5 high-quality inventories. Marchesini and others explored this same approach in the Mediterranean in 2014 and found that they could slightly improve the performance by developing this nonlinear model. and see what that looks like here. And then they collaborated with some Chinese scientists to extrapolate that across the globe. And that's that 2021 non-susceptibility map that I showed you earlier in the talk. So they also used about 40,000 landslides in their inventory. And so now we have this much greater landslide inventory approach, but we're going to use a similar approach of slope and relief. So here's just an overall summary of how we improved or updated the model relative to the prototype developed in 2012. We've basically an order of magnitude increase in terms of the number of landslides and resolution. And also our analysis is a 10-meter elevation, so we're using 10-meter slopes. And I didn't have that on the slide here, but to calculate relief, we used the 100-meter moving window, and then just difference the highest and lowest elevation within that 100-meter moving window for each 10-meter grid cell in our model. Then we downsampled that to produce a 90-meter output resolution map, and that just 90-meter coincides with some other products such as population data, et cetera, that we thought was useful, and felt also that 10-meter was just a little too high resolution for a national product. It covers CONUS, Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, and I should note that we could do this for other U.S. territories, but there just isn't enough landslide and high-res topo data to do it for all the other U.S. territories. Scott and I just sort of explored this approach and demonstrated that it's very useful, and we wanted to really have a robust model that we were confident was useful for prediction. And so we did quite a bit of calibration and validation. We evaluated first 4 alternative models, linear and nonlinear. I'll explain those in a second. For each of those models, we did 50 independent runs using a 70-30 split sample calibration. So really robust, and then used the mean value of those 50 iterations to evaluate different models. And then after that, we started this work a few years ago. We had the 2022 inventory compilation, but in the meantime, identified some additional statewide inventories, and in the end, had an additional 195,000 landslides that we could use for independent testing of our model. So really a nice extra validation of our approach, and I'll talk about all of that here shortly. There was a lot of data pre-processing involved, though, first of all, to just extract slope and relief across the entire country and then assign that to all of the landslides. We did have to turn every landslide into a 10-meter point or grid cell across the nation. And so for polygons, we decided to use the highest elevation point. Now, some of the polygons in the inventory compilation are alluvial fans or debris flow deposits. Some of them are the entire polygon of a landslide from source to toe. Some of them are just the initiation zones. Some of them are like property outlines that were impacted, for example. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in our data set, and there's many different ways we could have approached this. In the end, we thought that the highest elevation point was the most robust assumption we could make. So there's lots and lots of landslide data, and I think there's a lot of things you can dig into just the data alone and have some interesting insights. But there are several of the U.S. North American ecoregions that really dominate, especially in the Pacific Northwest, West Coast, Appalachia, and Puerto Rico. So we looked at the percentage of landslides, but then also the concentration. You can see that Puerto Rico is just off the map in terms of the concentration of landslides, and that was reflects the devastating effects of Hurricane Maria. Looking at the cumulative frequency distributions, you can see, wow, there's a lot of landslides that are actually happening at very low slopes and relief values. But then there's also some at very high slope and relief values. So this was sort of the starting point, just the data for looking at linear models in the same way that Gott and others did in 2012 and Marchesini et al. Did for the Mediterranean. And we used the ecoregions instead of the state inventories to constrain those linear threshold calibrations. We also did look at weighting by ecoregion density, but for that model, we did remove Puerto Rico just because otherwise it turns into a Puerto Rico model. So here are the 4 different linear and nonlinear models that we considered. There's a slope linear function of relief, and then a nonlinear function of slope and relief. And we looked at the weighted and unweighted. So the unweighted is just like what GOT and others did. The weighted, as mentioned, based on density of landslides in each ecoregion, minus Puerto Rico. And then the nonlinear models, we looked at the 5th percentile quantile, just like Marchesini and others, and then we looked at a slightly less conservative 10th percentile, kind of more similar to what GOT and others did for the linear model. On the figure on the right, you can see the 50 trial runs or iterations of that model, 70-30 split calibration. And the linear weighted model, this orange one, looks really well constrained. The linear unweighted didn't really have as much success in converging on a uniform parameter value. And for that and other reasons, we decided not to use that model. The nonlinear model is also really tight calibration here, you can see. And so in the end, moving into the next stage of evaluation and model selection, we eliminated that linear unweighted model. So here's what all 4 of those look like, though. And again, this considers the downsampling from 10-meter analysis to our 90-meter model output. You can see plotted here slope and relief of all the landslides in our database, the number of landslides in each sort of little binned pixel here. The linear unweighted model is the highest and misses a lot of landslides as well. So not only was it kind of poorly constrained, it also doesn't capture a lot of the landslides. Linear weighted does a really nice job here. This is the little orange dotted line you can see. And through the range of sort of normal slope and relief values, it's very similar to the N10 or the nonlinear 10 model. And then the N5 model is the lowest. You can see captures the most landslides. So that's really attractive. And overall, we wanted to develop a model that captured the most landslides, but we also want to take some false positives into consideration. And also think about where are the false negatives occurring. And that's what I'm going to show in the next slide here. When you're looking at continental scales in a very clearly incomplete inventory, we can't really truly have confidence that a landslide hasn't happened just because we haven't observed it yet. And so while we can say with some degree of confidence that landslides have happened where we've observed them, we can't use all the non-landslide pixels within our model as negative or non-landslides. And so instead of actually calculating these false negatives or false positives, we use the true positive rate and then the area of landslide susceptible terrain. And that's what's shown here in the upper left-hand plot. We've got CONUS landslides captured by the N5, N10, and linear weighted models, and then the percent area covered by those respective thresholds. And what we can see is that we only lose not even 1% of the total landslides in the inventory, but are able to reduce the area covered by 8%. And that really greatly increases the frequency ratio, which we also calculated. So in the end, we sort of tossed out this N5 model for that reason, and there's just too much area covered, even though it captures slightly more landslides, but imperceptibly slightly more. We then compared the N10 and LW models here to the 4 statewide inventories that I mentioned. We have inventories from Idaho, Maine, North Dakota, and West Virginia that were not in our calibration data set, but we used for independent testing. And what you can see in here is that in each case, the N10 model does slightly better at capturing all those additional landslides. And then we look at Maine, just the 405 landslides mapped across Maine. Our N10 model captures all the modern ones and quite a few of the historic and prehistoric landslides that occurred post-glaciation in Maine. So that sort of addresses the true positive and false positive part of evaluating our model, and it's looking like the N10 is the one to choose. But we also wanted to see where were we missing landslides, and so we did that to some extent with the proximity analysis. So this is just the 1% of landslides in our compilation that we missed with those models, and what you can see essentially from this is that almost all the missed landslides are within 1 to 3 grid cells, 90-meter grid cells in our model, so less than 300 meters away from some susceptible terrain. So that comes into play when you're applying these models across the country. So this shows, the gray shaded area shows everywhere in the United States and Puerto Rico that exceeds that N10 threshold, with the white being the negligible susceptibility. So that's about 42% of the land surface area across the study area, and 99% of the landslide. So this is fantastic. This is a great improvement in a number of ways over the previous prototype model. But we also realized that there was a lot of information that we were throwing out in our downsampling analysis. So I think I mentioned this, that we used 10-meter analysis, and then we downsampled to 90 meters, such that anywhere within a 90-meter grid, if there was one or more cells that exceeded 10-meter cells that exceeded the threshold, then we consider that to be that entire cell to be susceptible. But there's a lot of information that we were sort of throwing away in that, like you could have a 90-meter cell with only one 10-meter pixel exceeding that, or you could have all 81 of those 10 by 10 meters exceeding the threshold. And so we were curious whether this might give us more insight into variable susceptibility across the country. So we started looking at this range from 0 to 81 in terms of, does it actually add some value in landslide prediction and kind of constraining relative susceptibility. So here we have that shown. The graph on the left shows cumulative percent and the cell count. And so the blue line is the cumulative percent of landslides captured, and the green line is the land surface area covered. And so when you have 0 or 1, a threshold of 1 cell count, this is essentially our threshold model in gray. There's 42% of the land surface area, 1 minus the value here, and then 99% of the landslides. But what you can see is that the vast majority of these landslides are all happening in this much higher cell count. And that's actually not really at a very large area of the United States that's covered. So we're going to drill into that a little bit more. I want to stress that the model that we're releasing and that our analysis is a continuum from 0 to 81. But for the colored maps, I'm just going to show equal intervals 1 to 15, 16 to 31, 32 to 47, and 48 to 63, 64 to 81 being these sort of 5 equal interval breaks. And that's shown for the Puget Sound region on the right here. And you can nicely see, for example, the coastal bluffs around Edmond, Everett, and along West Seattle are all very high susceptibility relative to the interior. And then as you move up into the Cascades towards Mount Rainier, we can have these very high concentration of susceptible cells. So now we have this national map that is a little bit more colorful, a little bit more exciting, and also sort of nicely shows what intuitively we know about landslide occurrence and susceptibility across the U.S. It really highlights that, for example, the Appalachians, the Rocky Mountains, Marine West Coast, et cetera, are much higher susceptibility relative to, there is still some hazard in Minnesota, North Dakota, central United States, but it's just not quite as dark red as some of the areas we know there's lots of landsliding. Southeast Alaska, again, for example, Puerto Rico. So this is now our new map, and it's really exciting. I'm very happy this is going to be released soon. But we wanted to compare this to existing models. So this is just for the 4 models I talked about here: the Radbrook Hall et al. Landslide overview map, the Gott et al. Prototype non-susceptibility map, NASA's heuristic fuzzy logic model, and the Gia et al. Non-susceptibility map relative to our N10 model. And what we're showing here on the left column is the landslides by susceptibility class, and on the right, the land area covered by those corresponding susceptibility classes. Now, all the existing ones have this sort of qualitative description that to me is in some ways very unsatisfying, but a reviewer asked me to specifically give some values to these equal intervals. So you could really put whatever qualitative descriptors make sense to you. But essentially, what I really like is that we have this nice continuous numerical values for our susceptibility rather than some qualitative descriptors. The big thing that jumps out, so there's lots of different ways you can look at this, but I'm going to point out 2 really critical things. One, the best thing in my view about our model is that the most or the highest percentage of landslides are observed in the highest susceptibility class. And that is not the case for the other two, Radbrook Hollidahl and Stanley and Kirschbaum, that have multiple susceptibility classes. Instead, in those, we actually see the greatest percentage of landslides in sort of moderate and low susceptibility terrain. And so that's potentially problematic. And yes, there is some reporting bias in that more landslides are reported and documented in potentially lower susceptibility terrain, because that's where humans are more likely to interface with landslides. However, we're still really happy with this kind of general finding of the model. And then relative to the some and none classes, it's a little harder to compare. But again, we also think that we're doing great in terms of percentage of landslides captured. You can pick any cutoff you'd like compared to the ones captured by those other two models for a corresponding surface area of the country. And so whereas some models, for example, the NASA model was specifically the classes were selected to be decreasing in area as you increase susceptibility, ours is developed, or the result of ours is that we have an increasing likelihood or percentage of landslides as you increase susceptibility class. And so that's, I think, a really great contribution here. I just showed you analysis for CONUS so that we could do sort of this unbiased cross comparison across all those 5 models. But now I'm looking at the five different ways of looking at it for the entire country, including Puerto Rico, just Alaska, just Hawaii, just CONUS, and just Puerto Rico. And you can see there's quite a bit of spatial variability in model performance and in susceptible terrain across those different regions, especially looking at Puerto Rico. Wow, more than half of the island is covered by this highest equal interval class, and 92% of the landslides are within that class. So I think what this points to is that there's kind of a need to, although this helps show nationally quite a bit of variability, there's also a need, if you were going to use this at a local, state, or non-national level, there's a need to kind of consider what is the appropriate classes and cutoff for different risk tolerances. Another type of spatial evaluation we did is in some ways a lot simpler, but I think a very, very cool and provides some really cool insights. Here we are just plotting 2 things. And I guess, hang on a second. Here, this little inset here shows that on the y-axis in the pink colors is the percentage of susceptible terrain within each county. So I should say this is a county level analysis. And then the blue colors here show the number of documented landslides per square kilometer of susceptible terrain. So sort of landslide density versus amount of susceptible terrain. And so essentially what this model, what this is doing is showing us where our model works well, where our model doesn't work well, and where we may expect to find more landslides if we went digging. So in gray, this is sort of low percentage of susceptible terrain and a low density of mapped landslides. That's good, that's what we expect. In the upper right corner, this bright violet, there's a high percentage of susceptible terrain and again, a high density of mapped landslides. That's also good. And this sort of light purple in between is also great. But then up here in the upper left corner, this bright pink is a high percentage of susceptible terrain with a low percentage of mapped landslides. And so that's areas, for example, if we look across the border from Kentucky to North Carolina, there's nothing magical happening across the Appalachian here in the state borders in Virginia and Tennessee. There's just not reported mapping. So those areas where we went in and mapped, we'd expect to see more landslides. Conversely, the blue is areas where there's a high density, or relative at the national level, high density of mapped landslides and a low percentage of susceptible terrain. And so that's areas where maybe our model didn't do so well, for example, along the North Dakota-Minnesota border, other parts of Minnesota, and a couple other notable locations as well. So, and I should point out, yeah, Puerto Rico and Southeast Alaska are also showing up as areas in the Pacific Northwest and California, where there's a lot of landslide mapping here in the Rockies, areas where our model's doing well. And then really just all up and down Appalachia, the Ozarks, parts of the Northern Rockies could handle a little bit more mapping potentially. So this is great. This is like it shows us at the national level in the coarsest way. You could look at this in more detail, of course. Where is our model doing well? Where do we need more data? And that is potentially useful guidance for funding or for more research on susceptibility. And it also really highlights the value of statewide mapping efforts by state geological surveys and other entities. And I really want to stress that our compilation of inventories is largely individual inventories mapped by the USGS, and then statewide inventories mapped by state surveys and similar organizations. So again, this is now showing that same schema with the pink, purple, blue, etc. But now we're looking at sort of before and after for the 4 statewide inventories that we included in our independent testing. So Idaho, about almost 5,000 map landslides, Maine, a little over 400 map landslides, North Dakota, 60,000, and West Virginia, over 100,000. And so what these show now is sort of this great change before the statewide mapping and after. And in Idaho, a lot of the areas where we would expect to find the most landslides are in fact shifting from pink to dark purple. There's also a few counties where, there's more landslides mapped than we may have expected based on the model. And Maine, it's not that many landslides. Probably there's still some mapping that would reveal further landslides, especially along the northeast coast. But North Dakota really stands out, and I should point out that North Dakota has done a really nice job doing this. Probably the most complete statewide inventory in the Midwest. Minnesota also has a nice one, and so there's also some glacial geology involved and things that maybe reasons that our simple slope relief threshold is not working that well, and so this is an area where further research might be helpful. Whereas in West Virginia, wow, okay, everywhere that was bright pink is now dark purple when you include these 108,000 landslides. So this, again, just really stresses the value of statewide mapping and how this model is also maybe useful everywhere, but not really correct everywhere either. We drill down a little bit deeper. This chart is a little bit more difficult to read with all the states, but we're basically looking at states, all 50 states, and then the number of counties with land that's susceptible but 0 mapped landslides. So this is just a number of counties, and we cut it off 50%. So if more than half of the county is susceptible to landslides and it has 0 mapped landslides, then it's showing up here. And really what stands out are Appalachia and Ozark Mountains. So Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Georgia, Ohio, Tennessee, and Virginia, among others. So really those are areas where there's a potentially higher susceptibility throughout the county and not a single landslide that is in our inventory, at least, that we've compiled. This new model has a lot of potential value for systematic risk analysis. For example, this is just 2 locations, Southwest Washington, North Central Florida, and what's shown in gray is that previous prototype model from Gott and others, and our new model showing these different cell class counts. And again, you could add whatever qualitative descriptor you want here, but essentially 0 is negligible, and then there's some increasing degree of susceptibility as you get from orange up to red in our model. So the interesting thing, if you look at before our new model, these 2 locations essentially look very similar, a lot of gray area that is potentially having some susceptibility. But then when you start looking at our model, you can see, oh my gosh, in Southwest Washington, there's way more areas with a much higher susceptibility, whereas in North Central Florida, there's less. Additionally, that higher resolution output allows us to look at some of these areas, for example, north of I-75, where there's clearly some anthropogenic features going on. And actually, if you go look, there's some mining and other industrial operations here that is creating sort of even a fairly gentle slope in low relief terrain can exceed that threshold and potentially be a landslide concern, even if it's not a natural feature. So this right away just helps illustrate what a nice advance we have in terms of the increase in resolution and the increase in information content. There's a really nice LHP seminar on March 20th by Sabrina Martinez. I encourage you to go see it. And this is just a teaser of what sort of things this new nationwide map can facilitate. And so what Sabrina did was look at population exposure analysis and just some basic questions. How many people are vulnerable to landslides and when, day and night? Where are most people exposed and who are they? And so we leveraged this new national susceptibility model. We looked at the Oak Ridge National Lab Landscan population model, which is also 90-meter, and then this American Community Survey from the Census Bureau to look at those questions and the key findings. And again, refer you to Sabrina's talk to dig into this, but 75 million people during the day, 85 million at night are in some sort of susceptible terrain across the United States. That's a substantial percentage of the population. If we look at just the highest susceptibility class that in the previous slide I showed is sort of the pinks and reds, that's 9 million during the day and 16 million at night. So certainly people more exposed in their home, more people living in susceptible terrain than working during the day. And the greatest total population exposure, not surprisingly, in California, whereas the highest proportion of population in West Virginia and Puerto Rico. And that proportion has a big implication in terms of resilience in the state level. And then lastly, of those highest susceptibility terrain, 5.5 million of those in the most exposed are in counties with a high poverty rate. So that also gives us some information in terms of vulnerability and exposure. So again, this is a really cool study that we're working on getting published, and Sabrina's got a nice presentation of that you can view online. So lots of other potential applications, and I'm excited to talk with anyone about that. But I do want to say, so first of all, we are going to make both the N10 and linear weighted models publicly available. That data release will be accessible at this DOI very soon. I want to say there are limits to the slope relief concept. This is inherently general, and we wanted a model that worked well enough everywhere. But in reality, you got to really take some good judgment and caution when using it at the local scale. For example, the highest elevation point is not always the steepest. Some of the assumptions we baked into our model and analysis maybe aren't correct. This is an example of one of our missed landslides from Glacier Bay. You can see like it's surrounded by all this very high susceptible terrain, but we have a unique landscape with glaciers, some flat stuff, some benches that maybe don't work that well with the slope relief model. So I want to remind everyone about our proximity analysis, that if you're within 2-3 grid cells of a susceptible terrain, well, we don't explicitly consider runout. We don't consider the size of landslides. So use with caution, and perhaps even further upscaling if you're looking at some larger areas. Also, there is nothing that is a substitute for looking at the landscape in a detailed site analysis. So this is hopefully just sort of a screening tool to use at the national level and or in places where there is no other local scale tool. And so whether you should send boots on the ground to look at landslide-prone terrain. And these are those same locations from central Washington and northern Florida. And you can see that obviously the landscape also tells a whole other story about what's going on here. So I'm just really happy to have had this chance to share the exciting contributions from my co-authors and I on parsimonious approaches to national and continental scale susceptibility modeling. We've developed this updated map with uniform coverage over CONUS, Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. The improved resolution and performance over existing models. So it's really from 1 kilometer to 90 meters and is performing better at capturing nearly 1 million landslides that we've done. We've compiled across the country. And in particular, this downscaling method is really intriguing, and hopefully this method will be useful for others in other locations. We like that it's really transparent and flexible in terms of allowing a full continuum of values that users could have. And we think this is some potential applications at federal, state, and for other agencies, and in particular in areas where there isn't already some local scale map. But it is not intended to supplant or replace better local scale susceptibility maps that are developed with similar or better data. For example, Puerto Rico, we included Puerto Rico just to sort of give this national, how it fits in at the national level, but there's a great existing susceptibility map in the USGS for Puerto Rico. So it is overly general. We don't consider regional variability, and so if you're looking for local applications, you may want to be careful about selecting appropriate cutoffs within that 0 to 81 spectrum. It's a gridded map that may be overly detailed, so downsampling or using slope units, for example, is maybe the next iteration we're going to look at. And just a reminder, this is susceptibility, not hazard, and that's really important when considering frequency and magnitude and impacts of landslides from one location to the other. These are not the same thing. It's just potential for landslides. So thank you so much for your attention, and I hope this work is going to be useful for all of you all. Thank you so much.